So, Lori Lane Zucker, founder and CEO of Impact Entrepreneur. We're here at the SOCAP conference in San Francisco, California, 2019, and I am really thrilled to have the co-founder of the SOCAP conference and a true visionary of the impact space, Kevin Jones. Kevin, thank you very much for joining me.
I'm glad to be here, Lori.
Kevin, let's talk about SOCAP and briefly about the origins of SOCAP. Why did you start it, and how have you seen it evolve over the years?
Well, there are two parts to the origin story of SOCAP. One of them starts in Bill Gates' office, and another one starts in people not wanting to hear what people who are not in the room are saying. So I'll start with the first part. We were starting an early one of those funds that are now called impact funds, and we wanted to invest in a fair trade coffee company led by somebody who'd been a direct report of Bill Gates. So we got into Bill's office because, John was on the first name basis with Bill. And at 16 seconds into the presentation, Bill stood up and said, "Stop. I can't be around this idea." And he said, "Look, I have two pockets." And he patted his right pocket. He says, "I have one pocket I want to put all the money in the world in. And I have a second small pocket I want to put some money in to do good." If you say there's a link to those things, essentially if you say, if I can think like a philanthropist and act like an investor, you have to leave. We got kicked out of two other billionaires' offices. We lasted about 5 or 10 minutes in the others, but they still couldn't be around the idea. We were challenging the dominant myth of capital. And rather than changing what we were selling, we said, no, we want to change the way investors are thinking. We want to demolish two-pocket thinking and make it so you can think like a philanthropist and act like an investor, that you can invest for good and not just give for good. That's one part of it. The second part, as these things were starting, there were several gatherings happening, and in early markets, there's a lot of true believers who want to fight over definitions. And there's lots of fundamental battles that happen over there. And there were two groups. One was put together by Tides doing a convening, and another was put together by the Aspen Institute. And I said, look, I was just getting credible enough as a tech cash out to get in these rooms. And they said, you're using different words. Can I do a conversation map to say, this is what they call it, and this is what they call it? And they thought that was a good idea. I forget which group thought it was a good idea. And then they said, there's 10 minutes for it. And then they said, there's no time for that. And I said, don't you want to hear what the people who are not in the room are saying? And they said, no, we think we have the right people in the room. And I said, they're catastrophically wrong, and they're limited by their way of thinking to do what they should. They were trying to build a summit rather than a marketplace where you find the valuable stranger and create the intersections where they become unlikely allies. And so there's one of those groups is still convening 30 people of true believers, and they haven't decided on their definitions yet. You don't do definitions in early markets. They're messy, and they're supposed to be messy. So it led us to be the intersection of money and meaning. And so we want to bring in unlikely allies who wouldn't find each other normally. And so we're the space between all the caravans at the Oasis. And it's worked. That's why it's worked.
It sure has. It's the largest impact investing gathering in the world, right? And it has been
we've been the largest for about 8 or 9 years, and we're still growing a little bit. We don't want to be larger than 3,000. We're about 3,000 now, and we don't want to be any larger than that. Well,
we could talk forever about everything related to impact investing because you are so knowledgeable about so many aspects of it. I do want, though, to focus in on what you're doing now, because wasn't it a couple years ago that actually you and the co-founders sold SOCAP to another group, and you've been moving on to some really interesting stuff, so I'd like to hear about that.
Well, I got into working with accelerators, working with marginalized entrepreneurs at the neighborhood scale, not venture stuff, but friends and family funding for entrepreneurs who don't have a rich uncle. And we built a thing called the Runway Project with Self-Help Credit Union that's working, and it's gets money out to those folks. And I believe that entrepreneurship is the path to wealth for marginalized communities. But they're not going to venture, and one of the reasons they there's statistics where about, I think it's 80% of first-time entrepreneurs fail, and if they do a second time, they succeed at about 60%. But in these marginalized communities, they're not getting the friendly friends and family funding. So we built a thing to do that, and I started working with all those accelerators. They're doing that. Mortar in Cincinnati, Ujima, Build in Detroit, Optima in Oakland, all those kinds of things. And so I started, Self-Help then called me about 3 years ago now, and they said, hey, we have another friends and family problem. And I live in Asheville, North Carolina, because my grandsons live there. And there was a group that had immigrants who have a savings circle. Now, all immigrant groups have savings circles. And in Asheville, the immigrants live in trailer parks on the edge of town, and they're afraid of internal displacement, and we gentrify. Well, in that case, somebody had a rich aunt that died and let them buy the land under their trailer park. So they said, but they realized there's no other rich aunt in anybody's network. And so they said, let's build something. So I worked with Self-Help and Impact Assets to try to do a leverage thing where $1 from a savings circle could be matched by Self-Help with a donor advised fund as collateral. And that's working, but it's a slow thing. Now that group is getting funded by a great group called the Seed Commons from Working World, but right along that time, I got approached by a friend who said, do you ever work with immigrants? I said, well, I have been. And one of the things with immigrants and these saving circles is you don't have to bring them a solution. You have to see what they're doing and help them do that. So you learn to follow rather than be a leader, which is an odd thing because, nobody talks to, a straight white male and said, I see a follower in you. We're all told to be leaders. Well, in this case, you need to be a follower. And so I started looking at the Somali community, and I started getting some relationships up there in Minneapolis with Somalis. It's the largest Somali community. And the problem is they don't want interest. Usury is a sin to Jews, Christians, and Muslims, but Muslims actually act like that. Somebody's knocked over the camera over there. Yeah. So anyway, we can go back to that. So we've come up with a solution, which is neighbors investing in neighbors without interest. And so we've got a thing where 200 people will put up $2,500 to buy the first house, the first two houses, and then they will own your house, and we'll get allies to invest alongside that. We should be actually incorporated as a what's it called? A kind of cooperative, a hybrid cooperative by Wednesday, and we hope to close on our funding on Thursday to replicate this thing. But if you talk to immigrants and you say, would you invest in your neighbor's mortgage? They say, of course I would. Can I get on the list to be in a house? So I think it's got huge potential because immigrants are already investing in each other. And so this is like saving circles done at scale. We talked to one Somali man about this idea. He says, this is completely new and innovative, but my grandmother would understand it in 30 seconds, who's died 30 years ago. So we think it's got a lot of potential.
Amazing. What's the domain where the audience can find out more about that project?
Well, if you go to the transformseries.net, we've written some blogs. Next City has written about us. After we incorporate, which is Wednesday, we will have, and we close on our funding, which we think is Thursday. We will by next week, have a URL up that is its own thing. But so anyway, sorry. But the transformseries.net, we've written about it, and we will have our own website up if we get the money and the incorporation this week.
Well, thank you, and thank you for bearing with the possibly tilted camera from a bump there. We are live at SOCAP here, so we will just have to deal with the whatever comes up. Kevin, thank you so much for joining me tonight.